It's August 13th, 2016. Hello and welcome. My name is Brian McAvoy.
And I'm Tim Shank. This is episode 7 of Two Cyborgs and a Microphone, brought to you by Twin Cities Plus, creating an intelligent, capable, and resilient community.
Today we're talking about nootropics. Tim, this is definitely your field of expertise. I'm straight edge, so I have no expertise in it, and I'd like to hear what sort of things you've experimented with.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about nootropics, and I call it nootropics. I know that's wrong. The correct pronunciation is nootropics. Yeah, I've done a lot of work with nootropics, and even gone as far as taking some research chemicals that aren't even available to the general public. So I've had quite a bit of experience with them. So I guess we can just jump right in and I'll define it.
Yeah, I'd like to hear the elevator pitch for nootropics.
Well, basically, we're modifying brain chemistry, and most nootropics or nootropics are meant to change the balance of neurotransmitters in the brain, to do things like increase my attention span, increase my memory, attention, and recall. Some people use them to cause lucid dreaming, to enhance sex or creativity, to fight addiction. My reasons for using them, though, is always cognitive enhancement. I want to be more intelligent than I am.
Who wouldn't?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that sticks out to me right away is there are pharmaceuticals that do all the things you just talked about, and these are separate from pharmaceuticals. Is that correct?
No, I think the pharmaceuticals are the same. They're possibly more refined. Nootropics are generally over-the-counter or just out there as a supplement, as a nutritional supplement, but even the prescription medications that do some of this, and a lot of them are treatments for Alzheimer's nowadays or dementias. A lot of them are very harmless.
But nootropics aren't controlled substances, right?
Not all of them. Some are. One of the medications I take is Adrenal. And what that is it's a precursor for modafinil. So modafinil is actually the chemical that you end up with in your brain. But in the United States, that's a Schedule 4 controlled substance. You can only get it by prescription. In other parts of the world, modafinil is an over-the-counter drug. You can go into the drugstore and you can buy it without any hassle. But in the United States, that same drug is $12 a pill and it requires a doctor's prescription.
Jeez.
So that's one of the things that... So it really goes all across the spectrum, and even down to stimulants. I mean, things like methamphetamine, that does change the neurotransmitters in your brain, and for a short time in that case, you are more intelligent. Now, with something like with any kind of stimulant, you have troubles because they do damage to the brain, and you have a come down. Some people don't even consider those nootropics, but they do fit the definition.
I've heard the definition of a nootropic is something that is very low toxicity. But it sounds like some of the things you're talking about can be toxic in relatively small doses.
That is true, and I think more recently, I'm just looking at the Wikipedia article on nootropics just to check my own math, and according to Wikipedia, which is a somewhat trusted source, it does include stimulants and prescription drugs that do have a definite impact on the body. I would consider all stimulants to be some form of nootropic. Even caffeine in the morning, when you're sluggish and have brain fog in the morning, you drink a cup of coffee and the caffeine changes your mental state. I think what we're really talking about is supplements or medications that change your brain chemistry for a desired effect. And in that context, even nicotine is similar to caffeine, but more toxic and proven cancerous, does that. So even nicotine can be considered a nootropic drug.
Yeah, I've seen a whole thread about using nicotine as a stimulant for cognition. I think the people were opting for vaping because they didn't want the toxicity of all the stuff that comes with smoking a cigarette. It's a little scary to think about nicotine being used that way because it's got such a stigma attached to it. I've also heard people say that nicotine is pretty safe by itself. It's all the other junk that comes with cigarettes. What have you heard about that?
Myself, I do vape, and I appreciate nicotine for the stimulation and for the mental boost. And there is a definite mental boost. If you think about it, where do people sit and talk? Well, it's coffee shops and it's hookah bars. Those are prime places, tea shops and things like that. People go there to be intellectual, and maybe that's some kind of cultural thing, but maybe it's because things like coffee do make you more sharp or eloquent. You're a little bit more on your game when you're on a stimulant.
Oh, I totally agree. Now, I said I'm straight edge, but I totally downed a cup of coffee before the show because otherwise I'm boring.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way, I think. But so there's a ton of different nootropics, and the ones I focus on, and that's really my entire expertise, is on cognitive enhancement. Maybe I should back up here and talk about neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are chemicals in the brain that facilitate the jump of that spark from the axon to the dendrite of a synapse.
Yeah, let's hear some layman's terms.
Yeah, it's maybe more complicated than it needs to be. Your brain cells fire more readily and are received more readily. So you're more likely to make those mental connections between neurons.
Okay, so like when your brain feels foggy, it feels like kind of like you're walking through a fog and you can't see far, but this does the opposite. It kind of clears the air and allows you to see the big picture and see everything that you're trying to gather information about.
In some ways, yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of a specific scenario. And there's different neurotropics that do different things and affect different neurotransmitters. And I'll give you some examples. Acetylcholine is how you pronounce it. Acetylcholine is responsible for your attention span and your focus. So when you are having a day where you're having trouble concentrating, that is most likely due to a lower level of acetylcholine in your brain.
Oh, that's interesting.
By taking a supplement that increases the acetylcholine, you are much more focused, much more able to concentrate and stay on task. In addition, acetylcholine is tied to the storage of memories, the movement of a short-term memory to a long-term memory.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Now, you just used a new term that I hadn't heard. You've gone over nootropics, and then you mentioned neurotropics. Can you explain what the difference between those is?
Well, there really isn't. I think they're used fairly interchangeably. So that's kind of a bad on me. I should stick with the same terminology here. But neurotropics and nootropics, which are, I guess, nootropics, we decided. So they're really the same thing. There are a couple of other classes of chemicals that we can talk about in a little bit. Acetylcholine for the attention span and memory storage and retrieval. Glutamate, which increases your ability to learn, neuroplasticity, your ability to think outside the box. And then the third one is dopamine, which is entirely responsible for our drives. Now, with all of those, you need to be careful because you start messing with the brain chemistry, and especially, I warn people against dopamine. Dopamine is the source of all addiction. So when you increase the dopamine in your head and create more dopamine in your brain, that is by definition, that is an addiction. That is what creates an addiction. So there's a balance to be maintained on all of this.
So self-regulation is important.
Self-regulation and understanding of the science for me, because there's different ways that these supplements work. There's different ways that nootropics work. With dopamine, and this goes back to the adrephenil that I take. Adrephenil does increase dopamine and some of the other neurotransmitters, but it does it by stopping its degradation. So it's a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Instead of your brain creating more dopamine, which is what will cause you to be addicted, this just stops it from breaking down and being reabsorbed. So it's, in some senses, much more safe. And it isn't, and there is no addiction.
So I was going to ask, like, somebody who wants to get into this, and you said that the place that they should start is understanding the science of what's happening in the brain. Could not agree more. Where would you recommend somebody start? Is there a book? Is there a particular chemical, a website?
There are websites out there, and I don't have one to recommend at this time, but if you do a search for nootropics, you'll find a ton of information online. And that's spelled, for anybody who's doing a search, it's Nootropics. Usually I do searches for the online forums and web searches and the online forums and other sources, and I find the anecdotal evidence, because you'll find a ton of people saying they think it feels good. From there, you can track it back down to actual studies. And You're going to find studies that go in both directions, so you have to have some judgment about this yourself. Everything that is truly a nootropic, there are plenty of studies that validate it.
Yeah, if you're dealing with the chemistry of the brain, you don't want to rely on somebody just saying, yeah, it feels good, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who do, though. And there's a lot of placebos out there. There's a lot of things that just don't work. I've seen nootropic stacks sold commercially that when you look at the science of it, there's nothing that gets through to the brain or the blood in any of it. It all gets broken down in the stomach. But people take those and they say they feel great. They say they're more intelligent. They say they have better focus, more drive, all of that stuff.
Well, yeah, if you're spending $30, you're going to make yourself believe. You just used a new term that I want to hear you define. You used the word stack.
Stack. That is a combination of supplements that either work in parallel or enhance each other. So in my stack, I target 3 different neurotransmitters. I target glutamate, and the type of chemical I use for that is called an ampakine. Now, because that has a higher risk of what's called glutamate excitotoxicity, and this is the stuff that you have to be careful with all of this. If you have too much glutamate in your brain, it's possible for your brain cells to turn on and not turn off, which will burn them out, causing permanent damage. I also take something to increase the dopamine levels in my brain, and that's the adrafinil that I take, because dopamine protects against the glutamate excitotoxicity. But then again, you have to be careful. You don't want to create additional dopamine because that would lead to addiction. So I'm careful to do that with a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Instead of my brain creating more dopamine, it's actually breaking it down more slowly so that it doesn't come with the risk of addiction. And then in addition to that, I also take several different supplements that all work to increase my acetylcholine in my brain. So I have an acetylcholine agonist. I use Noopept, which creates more acetylcholine in the brain. But in doing that, you have to include choline supplement, because if you run out of choline, you end up with things like depression and brain fog. So I also have a choline supplement in addition to that. Additionally, there is another chemical that's in the body and brain that's called acetylcholine esterase, and that breaks down the acetylcholine. So I have an inhibitor so that I provide myself extra choline so that I can create more acetylcholine, and then I block the acetylcholine esterase through another chemical. So that's a stack. There's a number of different supplements that are all working together to create this balance, or to create these different levels of neurotransmitters.
It sounds like yours is pretty carefully measured.
Absolutely. And there's just so many of these, and honestly, Brian, a lot of this, the research isn't out on it. Recently, there's a lot more because of people trying to solve Alzheimer's and dementia, Parkinson's. So there's a little bit more recently, but a lot of these aren't really fully tested.
Now, you'd mentioned some possibility of permanent damage from leaving a neuron turned on. What kind of side effects should people look for when they're researching a stack?
Well, everybody's so different, Brian. It's hard for me to say, and I can't really make a recommendation besides to research very fully and to really pay attention to how you feel. For me, I'm fairly resilient with this stuff. I can take things that most people would make them feel uncomfortable or not well enough to continue, and I don't feel that same way at all. So it's really important to be careful, to do a lot of research, and make sure you're not going to short yourself. Like, for instance, increasing acetylcholine uses up all the choline in your body. That can cause problems. So do the research and really pay attention to how you feel.
Now, for someone like me, I'm totally a lightweight. If I have an energy drink, I get jittery. So you're fortunate in that you don't react poorly, at least not with super negative effects. Some of these that you've mentioned, it sounds like you dose pretty regularly. Which are permanent? Which are things that you take on a regular basis, and how often do you take them?
Brian, I go on and off with all of these. You don't want to do these all the time, because your brain has a habit of making up for something. So if there's too much acetylcholine, it'll stop producing it as often. So for me, I go on cycles when I'm doing these. I do usually 4 days on and 3 days off per week to give my brain a chance to reset back to baseline. Now, nothing we've talked about, I don't think, at this point has been permanent, but there are a couple of classes of drugs that actually increase neurons. I've taken something called NSI 189, which is impossible to find nowadays.
What's it do for a person?
That actually increases the hippocampal volume by adding neurons, at least in the animal models. Another one that I'm doing now is called uridine monophosphate, and it increases the synapses in the brain. So there are some permanent options, and I always advise, I'm a mad scientist, I'll be a guinea pig for people, but be aware that you can make permanent changes to your brain, and there's no actual evidence yet that this is a good thing.
Okay, I can see why that would crop up in research for degenerative brain diseases.
And there's a lot more to come on this, Brian. We're making advances daily in these labs. If you read the scientific papers, there's leaps and bounds of progress happening right now. So we can look forward to some really exciting times moving forward. Everybody, thank you for listening. We'd like to invite our listeners to email us at 2xcbmic@TwinCitiesPlus with any questions, any comments. We like your feedback.
And a special thank you to Zach Dolan, who created our awesome cover art for our podcast. We look pretty badass, if I do say so. I'm the one on the left. This is Brian McAvoy.
And this is Tim Shank. Please join us next time when we'll talk about transcranial direct current stimulation, actually putting current through your brain to increase your cognitive abilities.
Tim's used it, and I've built one. Join us next time.
You have been listening to Two Cyborgs and a Microphone, brought to you by Twin Cities Plus, creating an intelligent, capable, and resilient community.
Sorry, I had to kick a cat.